How many times have you made a box that has come out not square? It's not the tools, it's not you, it's just the way things go sometimes. And you know what? If you follow these steps, I am pretty confident it's going to iron out all of those blemishes. And because it's a commission piece, we're going to go in there and we're going to have a look at ways we can fancy it up, learning a couple of new skills on the way. They're not that hard. In fact, it's really easy. Let's just do the first thing that I do at the start of every project. If you're going to use hand planes, sharpen them. And sharpen all the ones you're going to use. Give yourself a spare as well. Don't just do one and think it's going to do the whole project. While you watch me do that very quickly, let me tell you about the commission. I have never ever been commissioned to do a piece of work before for anybody. So when I got a phone call off a very close friend of mine to do a commissioned piece for his brother for his 50th birthday, I had to say yes. But the one thing that comes with the pressure of making a commission piece for someone is also trying to make it individual. And a few months ago, I made it no secret that my favourite maker at the moment is Eric Curtis. So that will start to explain the t-shirt. But there's actually a deeper explanation into it that I'll get into in a few minutes. The picture on it gave me a great idea for the box. It also is quite helpful that it is a very nice t-shirt. So you got your hand tools honed. Next thing to do is calibrate them. Just get a piece of scrap wood and make sure they're cutting evenly on the left and right hand side of the iron. What I've done here is I've just taken my three most used, a number 4, my low angle jack plane and my jointing plane. And every time I come to make a box, my first decision is what wood am I going to use? You can use whatever you want. Use whatever you're commissioned to do or use whatever you like the look of. For me, I had oak and sapele left over from some other projects and I love the contrast. And what you're going to see here is the order I've done everything in. As I did it, bearing in mind I only had a couple of days to get this put together and posted, ready to be given as a present. The first thing I had to do was do the panel glue up for the lid. And I want to make the lid a floating piece of sapele because I think that's going to be where I can add all of the intricate extra touches. Annoyingly, my board's not quite wide enough, so the first job we're going to have to do is to laminate these together. So let me show you that first. So take your two boards, check the grain's going to match. If you are happy that you've got a nice tight joint, you can glue it. For me, even though I've had these boards ordered and planed to size for a different project, but albeit they should be fairly square, I wasn't happy with the joint. So let me quickly show you how I go about jointing. This is my number 7 jointing plane. It only takes a couple of passes and you'll note with this one, way too heavy a pass. I'm shocked that it actually worked. But you know what? With a finely honed iron in there, it looks like it's a lot of effort, but to be honest, it's not. So it just took a couple of passes, but equally you could do this with a number 5. Do remember what I've done here for my planing is not putting them side by side and then jointing them. I've actually taken the two boards I want to joint and I've folded them back to back, if you like, planed off that one side. So if you happen to get an angle on it, by the time you close it, that angle will match to give you a flat overall panel. Now for what I want to do, the joint doesn't have to look great, and actually on camera it looks a lot worse than it is, but so long as you get a good clean glue joint and you've got enough contact, when you get those clamps on, then this is going to hold up just fine. Don't be afraid to put a few extra clamps on at different places and a few for alignment, and don't squeeze all of the glue out of the joint. Obviously you clean up the glue squeeze out with an old pair of boxer shorts. Now the wood for the sides I actually ordered from a timber merchant and had it planed on all sides. What this does mean is you need to give it a good look over. Check for any blemishes, any marks, any knots that you want to avoid, but most of all, any wood that's been finished for you already has gone through a planer, so check the ends for snipe. Snipe is just where it gets caught up at the end of the planer on the way out, and with the tip of the board, it can move it closer to the blades and just take a little bit off at the ends. Just start your cuts on the nicer bits of wood. It's going to save you a lot of sanding or planing later on. The other beauty of having these boards ready-made to the sizes and the dimensions is also they come out with a pretty good finish. It should be fairly close to just needing maybe 100 grit onwards on the sanding. Now with my box, I laid out all the sides and just take a look at it and say, do you know what? Does that look how I think it should look? Because in some instances that can save you a lot of grief down the line. And at this stage, if you're going to follow the same technique I've done, which I'm going to show you every bit of it, I would suggest that you leave at least 2 mil to 3 mil extra on each piece that you're cutting, because we're going to cut these twice. It's not going to take you all that extra time. it's just going to mean that you're going to get a perfectly square box if you follow all of these steps. I've actually got the board wider than I need. That's going to come into play with a huge mistake that one of my tools throws at me later on. And it was a little bit scary, but I'll equally show you how to avoid it. So, a lot of you will know that I don't have a table saw, but you don't need one, because with a circular saw and a Craig jig, you can do everything on these smaller projects that a table saw can do. And here's where we leave that margin on the piece. So cut all of your boards so that they're a couple of mil difference maximum, and then line them on top of each other to do the final dimensioning cut. Butt the two ends up together on each piece and then just slice off a mil of the shorter piece, therefore cutting the longer piece to the same dimensions. If you get this right and you've calibrated your saw perfectly, you will guarantee that you are going to get a square box. Not just how you're making the rebates for the corners, it is actually how you're cutting the square end that butts into those rebates, because if it is slightly off, then your box will start to take a different angle because of that. But check out this video, because it's not vital to make a box square. It's just nice, and it gives you more options when it comes to how you attach the lid. In this case, I will hand on heart tell you the truth. This is the first box I've done with this full technique, and it is also the first box I've ever been able to put the lid on backwards and forwards and it still be perfectly matched to the millimeter, and that means it's perfectly square. Up until now I may have made 50 or 60 boxes, maybe more. Not one of them has ever been perfectly square, and it's never mattered that much. It's just nice to be able to do it. There's many different ways of cutting the rebate. In the past, I've raised up the circular saw on that Craig jig so that it's only cutting halfway through the board. Very similar to how you do it if you did it on a table saw and lowered your blade or used a dado stack. Using a router and a well-made router table, or even just anything with a fence, actually gets me a better finish. And because at this stage you've cut all the sides to the exact same length, when you put the rebates in, setting the fence and leaving it, it ensures that all of your rebates are exactly the same distance from the end of that board, therefore making your box square. I set the router at half depth. You can go a little bit shallower if you want. It depends on the look you're going for, but I think half depth gives it the strength and the look that I'm going for. And always do the innermost cut first and do it on all the pieces. It will just ensure that you don't have to move the fence away and then back in again, because that way you're losing a little bit of your accuracy. Because we're making quite a small box, it's important at this stage to close your fence off. I've talked about the importance of having an adjustable fence on these router tables. If you can close that fence off, then you're not going to get wobble on the side as the piece slides across the fence. And you'll notice at every stage during this build from here on out, there's no measurements. All I do is I'll pass a scrap piece of wood over the router and line it up with the markings that I've done on the box to make sure that the rebates are all in the right place and the depth is correct. It's much better than trying to measure it and going back to a number each time. Just make a piece and test it against what you want it to be until it's right. So once you've run every single piece through for each one of the cuts, adjust the fence accordingly and hog out the rest of the rebate. And just make sure after that first one that you've got exactly the right amount of space to be able to rebate the entirety of your side piece, depending on the thickness of the wood you're using for the sides. I'm not going to lie to you, you can just stick the base of the box to the bottom of this. As long as you're using plywood or something that's not going to expand or contract, just sticking the base on the bottom will work absolutely fine. I do think it looks a little bit nicer if you can rebate it into the bottom so that it sits just inside the box. And for that, I've just got a 1/4 inch bit and cut a rebate all the way around the box so that the bottom will sit in there. And I'm going to do the same for the top. Now the top is going to be wood, and it is going to be subject to wood movement. But I'll show you how I'm going to glue that, and hopefully that's going to stop any wood movement affecting this box in the future. A couple of test cuts to get the height right. Put it as high or low as you want. Obviously the higher up the box the base rebate goes, the smaller the interiors of the box is going to actually be. But leave enough wood underneath it so that it doesn't just pop it out if any weight goes into that box. I found that this has left a little bit of wiggle room. That wiggle room is actually going to go in our favour shortly. Let's talk about one of the major issues that I faced right about now on this build. I genuinely was proud of myself. Not for the mistake that happened. I was proud of myself for having prior preparation and leaving enough wood that this didn't ruin the entire project. You see, you don't need to cut your wood to the perfect dimensions until it's the right time. And at the very start of the project, if you cut everything to exact dimensions, perfectly, you've got no wiggle room. In this situation, my router bit came loose and went straight up through the box. Terrifying, right? Luckily, whenever I use my router table, I've got one of these on. You see what had happened here? The router bit held within this collet had started coming loose, and with the spinning had got higher and higher and had pushed its way through the side that I was running over it. You see what happens with the router, when you tighten up this nut at the top, what it does is it squashes the collet onto the bit. Inside the nut, check for dust, because a load of compressed wood dust had built up inside this nut. And what that meant is when I was putting pressure on it to lock it, the wood was compressing and it wasn't closing the collet properly. And so the bit kept coming out. But once I fixed it, I just ran the rebate on the other side. And here's the beauty. I had extra wood that I could let that mistake just be forgotten. It didn't derail my project. Luck as well as judgment. And so, second rebate cut the same as the first. Now we've got a place for the lid and for the base. And they should, because we've used the fence as a guide and no measurements and no adjusting, they should, when you put the box together, all match up around the perimeter. The beauty of the box being a rebate box, you've got a little bit hanging over the edge. By the time you've planed that off, you should have a perfectly square box. To deal with that excess wood, this is where it gets a little bit personal preference. If this technique scares you a little bit, I understand. Go with the handsaw and then plane it square. What I do is I put them lengthways on the crosscut jig. I set up a stop block to make sure I've got equal cuts, but then here's the issue. You don't hold it with your hand. That's madness. It's too close to the blade. You don't have a clamp that's going to get in there. I hold it with a block of wood. I'm stood behind the circular saw, so if it does flick the wood, the way the circular saw spins, it's going to flick it forwards. I am confident that that is not going to bite me. But if you're not confident doing this, as I say, get out handsaw, mark it with a pencil, cut it as close as you can. Once everything's glued up, you can plane it flat. Dry fit everything, check that your rebates go all the way around and meet each other, and if they do, glue it and stick it in clamps. It's good to go. If you want to pre-sand the inside of this design, go for it. You're going to see that's a complete waste of time later on. Like, a complete waste of time. Now, everything up to now is just a basic box build. You could stick a flat lid and you could stick a flat base in there and this box is done. Apart from cutting the lid off. I'm going to show you that in a minute. But as this is a commission, I wanted to go that one step further. So let's just clean up the wood first. And for this, you'll have noticed that I've closed the mouth off on the low angle jack plane because sapele has grain all over the place and I didn't want to get tear out. And I always start by overcutting the lid and then bringing it back down to dimension. So give yourself plenty of room. Consider it. Helps the channel. Now, the initial prep of this lid, I've completely neglected to film and show you. Basically, it's the same way you did the rebates on the sides. Just set your router to take the right amount off or sneak up on a fit that gives you just enough gap for wood movements sideways. So not lengthways along the grain, just sideways, because that's the way the wood's going to move, contracting and expanding with seasonal changes to humidity, etc. I just used the lid to draw out the base and give it a cut. And just to fancy it up a little bit, I just did some simple veneering. I ordered some veneer a couple of years ago and I've got some offcuts left of it from an old project. And the only thing that I've learnt over this time of veneering is do both sides. If you're going to use a plywood substrate and you only do veneer on the one side, it's going to cup. Because veneer, albeit thin, is still real wood, so it will still contract. Now, let's quickly just get back to this cool t-shirt. I bang on a lot about supporting your makers, subscribing, liking their videos, watching their back catalogues. Well, buying their merchandise is another way to go, and I felt that I should do this. So, when I watched Eric's back catalogue, after finding his channel initially, I found 2 videos where he'd made some really cool items, but he'd done some wood carving. And I thought, this is good inspiration for something I'm going to do, this project. You can see on the front of the picture here, one of them was a cool cabinet and the other one happened to be a small box similar to this. So I thought Eric deserved me to buy one of his t-shirts and wear it for the build. I decided to treat myself a little bit here and get myself a die grinder. These things are amazing. If you combine this with a Kutzall cutting ball, whatever they're called, they look like mini maces, then you can remove wood really quickly and really effectively. In fact, you have to be careful not to remove too much. With that tool in my hand, I set about trying to make something that was similar in style to what I'd seen Eric make. And he makes it look so easy. The die grinder is the first step. It removes the bulk of the wood and it removes it quickly. They're quite pricey, these Kutzall balls, but crikey, they do a good job. What they don't do is perfectly smooth the finish. So I didn't have that second step. I tried a few other things that I'd got lying around, but to be honest with you, I had nothing between the step of grinding and sanding, which is quite a hefty step. And I would think the best tool for this, from watching again Eric Curtis do his, is probably a Dremel with some smaller bits in it with some finer grits. Then you can work out any blemishes that you've left with the die grinder. What I had was a gooseneck cabinet scraper that could get into the curves. And to be honest with you, it did a really good job, but it is hard work. Then sanding. There's probably about 6 or 7 hours of sanding that went into this lid overall. But, and here's the positive, I thought the finished item came out brilliantly. For the base, you can glue it all round. Lock it in because it's plywood, it's not going anywhere. For the lid, I've put no glue on the edges. So where the grain runs lengthways, I've put nothing on the sides. At the front, I've just glued the middle third of it so that if it expands evenly or contracts evenly on both sides of that glue. So the middle can't move, but the outsides can. With that, then hopefully, as it expands, it's not going to get stuck and start cupping and ruin the lid. Now, this is just a tiny bit of cleanup, but it's really vital if you've cut your rebates correctly. You're going to be left with maybe 1 millimetre or 2 hanging over. Don't hit it straight away with a hand plane going into it because you'll just get a load of chip out. Take it off with a flush cut saw and don't worry, you're going to leave a little bit of marring. Then go back over it with a hand plane. Go from the outside inwards and don't push over the edge. My experience, because that's where you're going to get a little bit of tear out, and at this stage that could be really hard to hide. I have to say, hands down, in the last year, this is the cleverest, simplest technique that I've seen across YouTube. This is something I saw Pask Makes do. Amazing channel, check it out. He basically uses this Japanese saw and, well, he probably hasn't got something quite as janky as this to cut off the lid of the box. You raise your saw up with the blocks of wood. You then run it back and forth on the box to remove the lid. Then when I use double-sided tape to actually stick the saw down, I make sure that the distance that the teeth are protruding is less by about 1 mil or 2 than the thickness of the sidewalls. So I'm not actually cutting all the way through. And the idea here is you run the blade into the box and the actual block of wood stops it before it goes all the way through. I've used this flooring tile because it's smooth and flat. Also, line up the corners, because if there's debris underneath the block of wood that you're running on the tile, clean that out and make sure that before you start the next side, the corners match up and work on those first. If you take your time and you stick to that, you'll remove the lid and you'll have minimal amount of cleanup to do. You might want to run a plane over it 5 or 6 times in rotation to make sure you take the high patches off and you clean up what is left, because it just comes out with a few frayed bits. But once you've done that, you'll see straight away the lid, when you put it back on, sits really close to flush. With your plane set to take a really fine shaving, you might need to take the corners down maybe a fraction of 1 millimetre until the box lid, when you press it on the corners, doesn't wobble. Mark the front with a triangle, but at this stage, take a look at the box you've done and see if the lid can be swapped back to front so that it fits flush both ways. If it does, well done, you've got a square box. If it doesn't, don't worry, because if you mark it and that's the side that it always sits, then that's the side it always sits. I do this quite often just with a couple of little dowels so that it looks like a maker's mark, something that you can run through all your boxes, and it also keeps the grain lining up, so it does look a lot nicer. Now, between me and you, there are numerous ways to put this lid back on. Personally, I try and steer clear of hinges because although I showed you in a video a quick and easy way of doing the hinges, it's fairly pain-free, it's not perfect. Because I had limited time on this box and because I didn't want to make any mistakes, I've just put another layer of wood on the inside to hold the lid on, because you know that the inside of the base is level with the inside of the top. So if you put a piece of wood between them, it will hold it on. It will take a little bit of angling so that the lid sits on nicely. But if you protect the wood with blue tape and then just run a plane over it to get a little angle on it, and then sand it to where you get the right fit on the box lid. Depending on how you're going to finish this, for instance, if you're going to spray lacquer all over it, you might want the lid to be a bit looser than you want it to finish up, because with a couple of layers of lacquer on it, it's going to get a little bit bigger, and so you need to make sure that it's smaller to start with. It's going to look a bit weird, the next bit, because, well, I don't have the box to talk about right now because I've sent it away. It's been gratefully received, and, well, let's let Mark at the end of the build tell you about the end of the build. A couple of things I didn't show you is that this has about 5 coats of lacquer on the outside, and I've done some denibbing with 600 grit sandpaper in between some of the coats, so you get a really smooth finish. Because this particular box is going to be for storing cigars, I haven't put any finish in the inside. A little bit of beeswax around the edges of the lid so that it slides. I don't think that's going to affect anything. It's very weird finishing a video without the finished product in front of me, but for anybody that's made it this far in the video, take a look through some of the comments. I am hoping, guaranteeing, maybe there will be some people that will say, oh yeah, we can make a box that straight if we had all the tools. And yeah, okay, I've used a fair amount of tools in this. We haven't all got a die grinder, we haven't all got routers, etc. But during the video, it's led me to a bit of inspiration. And the next video that comes out is going to be for people that have made those comments. If it's been done, if you're watching this later than live, then I'll pin it up there. If not, there's another box build there, or a video that's perfect for you. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you've enjoyed it. If you watch one of the videos, I'll see you over there.